All right, good evening. Welcome to Draft Nation. I got a special guest today. Darren Vickless is back. It's been a while. Been a long winter, long rough winter for me, especially being sick. So we're back in the saddle. Darren, how you doing?
Pretty good. Getting over a cold myself,
Yeah,
but
it's
good to
rough,
be
man.
back and happy the Penguins are slightly more watchable post.
They're getting there. And let's get into them. 17, 17, and 8. Not exactly what you would expect. I mean, it's really under 500 if you look at it that way. I mean, they got basically got 25 losses if you put the eight ties, which I don't know how they really figured that out. I guess it's like four losses, right? You split it in half. You split
Pretty
your eight
much.
overtime losses, so you're still like seven. You're like 21 and 21 or whatever. However they figured it out. You got the 42 points. They're tied with Columbus for fourth in the Metro. Um, Darren, lately it's been fun to watch the Penguins, especially at the beginning of games and as the games go on. Carolina, they had a 2-0 lead recently. They had a 3-1 lead against Columbus. What has been the Penguins' issue that they can't hold leads? Is it goaltending? Is it just their defensive style? Is it a mix of both? What do you think's leading to these? I know two goal leads in the NHL is the cursed thing. It's the hardest lead to hold, but we're making it look really like it's hard to hold.
The big thing recently, it's never just one thing in a sport like hockey where there's constant motion and constant things happening on the ice. It's never just one thing. I mean, Jari is Jari. We know we can't rely on him, and Ned's been just as bad, worse in a lot of ways actually. Like if you look at the underlying numbers, but the big
Mhm.
thing recently is their PK was really good this year. From even when they were bad, their penalty kill was good. Like they were like a top 10 penalty kill team. They've now given up a power play goal, and I think six of the last 7 games, some of them they've given up multiple. That dropping a little bit in a sport where or with a team that you already don't have a lot of room for error with because of the goaltending. I think that's it. If they get a couple extra PKs, they're 2-2 instead of losing four straight games or three straight games in the shootout, whatever it is. I don't think they maybe beat Carolina because Carolina's good, but they probably beat Columbus and the Islanders and the Red Wings and whoever else. But the loser points matter. They're kind of doing what the Islanders have done for like the last half decade of just backdooring your way into the playoffs by losing 15 games in overtime. That's kind of what they're doing, and I mean that's not ideal. But I mean they're alive because of it. They're technically tied for a playoff spot now. If you go by points percentage, they have to leapfrog two teams, so they're technically third. But
Mhm.
that's not that reasonable or unreasonable, I should say, because the bottom half of the East really isn't that good.
And to go back with the Penguins, you were talking about the shorthanded, penalty killing. You were talking about what about the power play too? The power play has shown some signs of life during the season. I mean, they look a lot like they're the one guy that's impressed me. Put it this way, that I put him down in the past, and I have, and maybe for good reason, maybe for not. But I think Eric Carlson, the way he's been skating and playing, it just seems like he's more of a playmaker now. He's actually up. It seemed like he's upped his game. That movie made the other night. They made the pass for I can't remember who scored the goal, but he made
To,
the,
to
the play.
Bunting, yeah.
Yeah, like
I,
he's been showing more flash, like more. His defense still drives me nuts. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But the power play itself, what has changed in the Penguins' power play from the last couple seasons where they struggled so much?
they're being more direct with they just carrying the puck into the zone. They still do the drop pass, and it still kind of drives me insane because that really only works if you have someone like Phil Kessel, who's just an automatic zone entry, which they don't have anymore.
Mhm.
And Carlson's really not that post his complete ankle reconstruction. But the big thing for me is once they're in the zone, it's simpler. The puck gets down low to Sid, and it's either getting safely rung back around the boards to reset, or it's going into a high danger chance in the slot for Raquel or Bunting, who it's no surprise those have been their two most consistent goal scorers since the power plays really kicked it into gear right before Thanksgiving. I think they're a top third of the league in power play, or at least they were going into last night. You had a bunch of teams within like a quarter percentile of each other, but they're right around there. At least they're top half of the league. They're slightly above average in the power play.
Mhm.
And they're actually creating chances at 5v5. Their finishing is still not anywhere near as good as it needs to be. But I mean, you're top 10 in chances created at 5v5 this year. I mean, that bodes well. And it's why they're drawing more power plays this year.
And besides, I mentioned Carlson, who, and you already mentioned Bunting and Raquel. What other Penguin has really? Is there any other Penguins that have really impressed you, like up their game this year, or a newcomer that you're like, man, this guy's got something what we need.
You said Raquel, and that would have been because he looks like a completely different player versus
Mhm.
what he was for a lot of last year and the early-ish portions of this year. Sid's bounced back. Sid is Sid, but I would go with Owen Pickering, and not just because he's a rookie. He looks to me like what if Brian Dumoulin had a little bit more offensive upside? Is he ever going to score 10 goals as a defenseman? No, absolutely not, unless something crazy fluky happens. But
Mhm.
he could be a 35 point guy who's just good at getting out of his own zone and helping you to transition the puck. And he's underrated at keeping the puck in the zone,
Mhm.
which was a strength of Dumoulin. Like I said, I think he could be a Brian Dumoulin plus. And when you couple that with Brunicky in the system, you're maybe not as in Emil Pianemi. Shout out to him for having a great World Juniors tournament with Finland.
Yes, he
All of a
did.
sudden, you look like you have 3 NHL defensemen in your system. Now, are anything going to be stars? I really don't know, and neither does anybody else. The one that would have the chance is Brunicky or Brunick. I apologize, but yeah, but I would have to go with Pickering. Has been the most impressive because the knock with him was he's just kind of like a milk toast second pairing, not good, not bad kind of guy, and he is much more on the side of good. Don't get me wrong; he had a really rough game against Carolina. Sebastian Aho kind of put him in a blender multiple times, but that's what a perennial all-star should do to a rookie defenseman. And I think Pickering's going to figure it out, and I think if they do make the playoffs, Pickering's one of those reinforcements you maybe didn't expect to get that kind of puts you over the top. And when you look back, if they do make it, that's a big reason why. Is all of a sudden you got a viable left-handed defenseman when before you only had Pedersen in that role.
And maybe not a player, but is it a unit like third, fourth line, or a player itself? Who has really disappointed you this season, or what unit has disappointed you? I know that the Penguins seem to be in flux with the fourth line, third line. Like they put Puljujarvi on um, waivers. He comes back. He plays yesterday. I thought he played a good game last night, skating hard. I guess one of the reasons from what I was reading that he wasn't playing defensively sound game is one of the reasons I heard that they put him on waivers. Um, which players have really let you down this year? Where you're like, man, this guy just this doesn't have what we thought he had.
It's not even close. It's Matt Grzelcyk. I don't even think. I mean, the goalies are the goalies. It's an easy out answer to
Mhm.
say, and I've already complained on this podcast along with everybody else in Pittsburgh about the goaltending.
Mhm.
It's Grzelcyk. I will give him credit. He's actually been very good on the power play for about the last month and a half. He's actually been, for whatever reason, him and Carlson have worked well together on the point when they do decide to use two defensemen on the power play. They do some nice interchanges at the line. But at 5v5, I mean, oh my God, Grzelcyk is. I kind of see the ghosts of Jack Johnson a little bit. It's very rare.
He's a little quicker. That's about the only thing. I give him
He's
he's a
definitely a
good
better
skater.
skater. But I mean, in terms of the dread
Mhm.
of what is going to happen when this guy steps over the boards,
Yeah.
like when you couple that with Graves, like you have two left-handed defensemen that you cannot start in your own defensive zone, and sometimes you're forced to because you only have six defensemen. Um, yeah, it's painful. It's Grzelcyk, and I'm not trying to dogpile on the guy. Like, everybody and their mother has been very vocal about how disappointing he's been, and I kind of get why they took a chance. 2 years ago with Boston, and the year before that, excellent. A very good depth defenseman that had some power play
Mhm.
utility. Last year, though, he was so bad for Boston, he didn't even play pretty much the entire final third of the season, or even in the playoffs. You take him as a low risk reclamation project, so I totally understand why they did it, but the amount of minutes he's getting is definitely a Mike Sullivan error. And maybe it's a mandate from above. Play these guys so we can flip them if we're out of the playoff picture. That's always a possibility in this league, especially with how much power Dubas clearly has within Fenway Sports Group. But yeah, it's Grzelcyk for me. If I had to go forward, Tanner Glass, I really don't know what he does. Like he's fine.
I
Defense,
feel the same way, man. I feel like this guy's almost like in
he's
neutral. Like you're
fine.
not getting really anything positive or negative from him. It's like just he's out there.
He
Just like
reminds me of Marcel Gotch in that, yeah, nothing disastrous happens, but he just kind of exists and
Mhm.
he never attacks the center of the ice. And for a while, I was like, oh, maybe it's like like post concussion for him. He's hesitant to do it. But I remember went back and watched him of his highlights when he was like with Vegas and with some of these other teams, Nashville. He never attacked the center of the ice, even pre concussion issues. it's just not his game. And then in juniors, whenever you can bully people, but it's being a better athlete than them, you can get away with that. The goaltending's not as competent. The defensemen aren't as competent. But in the NHL, if you're not grossly more talented than somebody, you have to attack the net and get your nose dirty. And he'll do it along the boards. But I do not know why he does not attack the center of the ice. And it's one of the reasons I don't like him playing center. It drives me insane.
Mhm. And to get back to one of the guys you mentioned, we talked about this last year. It was his first year in the defensive system, and he may be able to bounce back his second year and playing these, getting used to the system. Has Ryan Graves showed you any improvement from last year to this year?
It's the improvement. There's an improvement, but it has nothing to do with him. It has everything to do with how the coaches are deploying him.
Okay.
Sullivan isn't starting him in the defensive zone anywhere near as much. It's like almost like 20% less of his zone starts now are in the D zone, and they're much more in the offensive zone or in the neutral zone. He's actually really good in the neutral zone starts for whatever reason. But defensively, he's not being pit into his own end. He's killing less penalties. And I apologize. I'm getting over a cold.
No problem.
But it's more to do with deployment, and his minute load has been reduced. He's been playing third pairing minutes. I guarantee if you put him back on the second or first pairing, we'd see more of the disaster we saw last year. It's just we're seeing less of him overall. And Grzelcyk was so offensively bad for most of the season that it's hard to be that angry at two different defensemen. So I think the Graves hate has subsided, but I don't think he as a player has improved. And it's still, outside of Tristan Jarry, the worst contract on the team by a wide margin.
And you already mentioned Brunick and a couple of the other young guys down in the minors. How do you feel Kyle Dubas has done with keeping his team somewhat competitive while starting to build up our farm system? And I even like the fact that we brought POJ back, a younger defenseman that was comfortable here. We've got talent down there. I mean, Tristan Bras is putting up he was putting up some numbers down in the minors. How do you feel in his second year now with Dubas? Do you think he's doing the right thing? You think he's starting to walk that tightrope pretty well, like keeping this team somewhat competitive while not giving up on the future of the franchise?
I'm of two minds on this. As a fan, I don't like watching my team lose 60 games, even if the tanking for the light at the end of the tunnel is the MO. I get it. I get why teams do it. I've seen the Penguins do it in my lifetime. It's why they were so good for so long. A lot with luck, too, not just tanking, as we've seen with Buffalo and Anaheim. You can tank all you want, but if you're not getting the players that you need, it doesn't matter. And that's kind of where I'm, and I apologize again. It's kind of where I'm of two minds of part of me wants them to just bottom out and move on. But at the same time, I know me as a fan would hate watching it, and it doesn't guarantee anything. You could very, very easily end up in one of these forever Anaheim, Buffalo, Red Wing rebuilds if the lottery ball doesn't fall your way. And so that's kind of where I'm at is I'm enjoying it for what it is right now. Whenever Sid falls off a cliff, it won't matter anyways, and they'll probably be a bottom three team. But for now, I'm just enjoying it. And I think McGroarty will be in the NHL later this year or next year. I think Braz, Pienemy, Brunick for sure. I think Brunick is out of all of their prospects. I think that's the one guy who jumps out that I'm like, okay, you might have something well above the NHL average here. But you have Braz, you have Koivunen, you have Ponomarov. Not all of those guys are going to stick. Like people thought Scott Wilson and Kuhnhackl were going to be NHLers forever, and that's just not how that works.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can get two or three of those guys out of the forwards, the Bras, the Koivunens, the Ponomarovs, and McGroarty, if you can get two or three of those guys to stick, along with the three defensemen who I think are NHLers in Brunick, Pickering, and Pienemy, maybe you're not as bereft as people thought, especially with the goalies, because you have Blomqvist, you have Murashev. You're probably not going to keep both of them. Teams get desperate for goaltending. That's maybe a blue chipper that you can flip for a blue chip in another position of need. To me, I still think Murashev is going to be the goalie of the future. I think his experience playing against grown men in Russia is invaluable. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Blomqvist is legit. But I mean, Murashev's on a run, and I get it. I know it's Wheeling. I know it's the ECHL. But he's been otherworldly for about 3 weeks down there, where he was giving up like one goal or less and like 7 straight starts or something like that. While in the Wheeling Nailers are not that good of a team defensively.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not that bereft. And I think if you can move one of the goalies and get somebody else of complementary status there, I think you're sitting pretty, and that the rebuild isn't going to be as bleak as people think it is. Now, you do need a star, and you're not going to get that by hanging out where the Penguins are, unless you get exceedingly lucky and you pick a Pavel Datsyuk in the 4th round. Also, Mikhail Ilyin is another forward I'd like to shout out who's over in Russia right now that I think is a legit middle 6 NHL forward. Maybe even more, but like I think.
And you mentioned a couple like the couple of trade things that the Penguins could do with the young goalie situation, getting rid of maybe one of them too, like maybe moving Blomqvist for what we need, maybe the deadline. But another guy, do you think a guy that you hear about the most because he's got a decent contract for somebody just to pick up, he's going to be done at the end of the year? Pedersen. Do you think Pedersen gets moved with the little bit of defensive depth that we may have that we didn't think we had with like POJ coming back? And do you think we could afford to move Pedersen maybe and bring in a prospect or two?
I do. Unless you've climbed into a spot where you're very comfortable in a wild card spot or higher. I mean, that would be really far fetched at this point. But you never know. It's the NHL. We've seen teams come from 3rd worst in the league to 105 points. Stranger things have happened. But I think Pedersen is movable because of what we were just talking about with Pickering, with Pienemy, with Brunick for next year. I think it would be grossly irresponsible to not move Pedersen unless, like I said, you look like a legitimate team.
You don't want to mess things up kind of thing.
And I think Pedersen's a guy that you can get a solid prospect and a 2nd-round pick for, or a 1st-round pick and some B- prospect that you roll the dice on. I'd be fine with either of those because they have a bunch of 2nd-round picks coming up in the next few years. Now, you'd like to see some extra firsts to really jumpstart this rebuild, but I mean, you take what you can get sometimes. And like I said, we've seen teams sell the farm, sell the house for those 1st-round picks, and it really doesn't mean anything unless the lottery ball kind of bounces your way.
It's totally true, and I like the fact what you said about I know Pedersen for one. I look at a bunch of rumor sites, but I know they're not always true. But I've heard from pretty good sources that Edmonton and Vancouver have been kicking around the Pedersen wheel a little bit and
use them or would need them, I should say.
And that's, I mean, I'm not saying they're swamped with prospects, but they have enough that they could move us a guy or two. And I agree with you about Dubas. I think we went from like 31st when he took the team over. We were at the 31st minor league system.
Yeah.
And I think we're up to like 24, 25 the last time I saw in the hockey news with like the arrow going up for a bunch of guys. So I think he's done a great job with that crushing this team's hopes, and he's kept them at least competitive. I mean, there's certain games you watch, it's like, oh, they look like they're just going to get crushed. But then there's games that they play these tough teams.
Florida well. They played Florida really well. Let me rephrase that. They played 40 of 60 minutes against Florida.
Yeah,
And Florida on their heels. They really struggled with the Penguins' forecheck. So you see there's moments where even the best teams in the league, the Penguins can absolutely run them over. And some of that's just the Sidney Crosby effect. The Crosby-Russ Raquel line can just take over a game, and you just kind of have to shrug your shoulders and be like, I don't know, man, there's nothing we can do. Or a night when Carlson is really clicking, there's not a whole lot you can do to keep the Penguins out of the offensive zone when that happens. But they're not going to sustain it enough, I think. And that's ultimately going to be why they finish at a point to 3 points out of a wild card again. That's what this feels like to me, which would probably be the worst result. You'd probably want to be 3 or 4 points worse than that so you can move into a top 10 pick. But again, doesn't necessarily mean anything now. And the thing with Edmonton and Vancouver, with Vancouver, I would be willing to take back somebody like a Niels Hoglander in a 2nd-round pick. Someone younger with clearly has upside that maybe hasn't quite clicked, like Tomasino. That injury is very unfortunate. But
yeah, he was
a guy that was going to push 20 really goals.
Good, man. I like the way he plays too, man. A lot of energy.
Tomasino is another young guy that you now have on your roster that you're not going to be as bereft. And if you get a guy like Hoglander and then a 2nd-round pick for him, if it's Edmonton, I'm not as familiar with their prospects. The conversation with them needs to start with the 1st-round pick because I just don't think they have the prospects to make it worth it.
I don't think they do either.
But, I mean, again, it comes down to, do you want a young roster player now and then like a lesser pick, or do you want the 1st-round pick and some B- prospect that may just rot in Wilkes-Barre forever and never amount to anything? I think it just depends what's on the table. Supposedly the Rangers are even interested in Pedersen. That would be fascinating because it's an interdivision trade. I don't know what they'd be willing to give the Penguins. And I've seen people say like, oh, you push for Gabriel Perreault. That's not going to happen. Gabriel Perreault, in hindsight, probably should have been a top 5 pick. He's that good of a player for that draft class, and I think that's going to be a point per game NHL star. So if you got Perreault for Pettersson, you should start tap dancing in the streets because all of a sudden you have a top 20 forward prospect in the entire sport. But yeah, they're interesting. I don't really. Tampa Bay has nothing in their farm system. You'd have to take a contract back. Like I've heard a lot of teams that would be interested in Pettersson. It's going to be, can they accommodate the salary and what do they have to offer ultimately? And do the Penguins have to take a bad contract back? I wouldn't be looking to do that.
And I talk to you about this. I think at least twice a year I ask you about this guy, and he drives me nuts. He drives me more and more nuts every year. And I know he's a superstar and he's a fan favorite, but I think that's even starting to fade a little bit. But Evgeny Malkin, where are you at with Malkin's play? The game that really made me upset was the game against. They've been in overtime so many times, and I'm getting them mixed up. No, I know that he didn't play last game. I don't believe it was Carolina. So it was the game before Carolina. They went to overtime.
No, it had been Detroit.
Detroit.
New Year's Eve.
It was a 2-on-2 or the 3-on-3 in the overtime. He literally extended himself to the point where he couldn't skate anymore. And he does it all the time. And I'm watching, I'm like, he's got to get off. Even the announcer's like, Malkin's still on. And he just does, to me, it's just, for a guy that's been in the league as many years as him, I just think his habits and his traits are he just can't make up for them now. I mean, I don't think he's taken as many bad penalties this year as he has in the past.
Definitely less offensive zone penalties. Definitely.
But where are you at with Malkin as a fan? I mean,
he's a perfectly fine second line NHL center at this point. And when you look around the league at the contract value, I don't really get mad at it. And you look at how Trocheck has completely fallen off a cliff and collapsed in New York at a younger age than Malkin. Yeah. It's why I was never that upset at Trocheck going to the Rangers. And the only reason I'm making that comparison is that was the guy that I heard over and over again, and not just from you, from dozens of people online, in real life. Trocheck. And it's like, look, man, I don't think people understand what an NHL second line center is, because the Penguins had 2 first line centers for 15 years. Yeah. And then Mario and Francis before that.
Oh yeah, we've always had a dominant second line center, man. When we haven't, we don't win.
I think the perception is, if your second line center is not a point per game or better guy, you don't have a second line center, and that's not reality. We just haven't had to live in reality again for the better part of 20 years here. So I think it's people coming to terms with that fact, young and old fans.
Some kids your age dealt with a little bit younger than you, but you grew up with Jordan Staal was your third center
they went from Jordan Staal, and then don't be wrong, Brandon Sutter was bad, but then you had Nick Bonino. So it's like,
yeah, I mean, the Penguins have done a good job up the middle, and I think that's gonna be the toughest part. Like what you said before, once Crosby does fall off a cliff, which I don't think he falls off a cliff ever. I just think he's a guy that gets to
when I say fall off a cliff, I mean instead of 85, 90 points, you're looking at 70 points. Like,
and I think he's the type of player that won't deal with it too much longer after that. He'll be like, okay, I'm at the end now. Like that's why I don't think he'll be that guy that plays and he's scoring 45, 50 points and.
Yeah, he's not going to do the Joe Thornton playing on the fourth line and then get power play minutes to get 40 points a year. He won't do that. No. I think he's a better athlete than Thornton, so I don't think he's going to break down to that degree. But there's a soccer pundit. His name's Jamie Carragher, and it's been memed to death. The video clip has been done to death. But he has a line: "Leave the football before the football leaves you." I think Sid would leave hockey before hockey leaves him.
I agree. I think he's too much of a mental guy that he wouldn't be able to handle it. Even like you said, just dropping down to 65, 70 points. I think mentally it would drive him nuts. I don't think he would, even though he's 40, he could be 42 years old at the time. He still would be like, I got to go. This ain't me. So, but which I think most guys are like that. I mean, Brady was still winning Super Bowls at 41, 42. So he kept playing. Yep. So, so I mean, I think Crosby.
I mean, he won an MVP at age 40, didn't he?
Yeah, I believe so. With Tampa Bay, which is insane. So
him and Mike Evans, something
else. So we talked about the Penguins a lot. You talked about who you were impressed in you and who's disappointed you. Who are some young guys right now in the NHL? And the NHL, me and you talk about this all the time. You can go on any team's roster. And this wasn't like this when I was a kid and I was the Sharks came into the league, and you get on rosters like, oh man, that team has nobody like to build around. Or now every team has talent, man. I mean, even if it's one or two young guys, but there's talent. But who are the young guys that are impressing you in the NHL right now?
I mean, we talked a little bit off the air, but the San Jose Sharks with their three youngsters, obviously led by Macklin Celebrini, if he keeps this pace, he wins the Calder in a walk. Like it should be unanimous. He's so much better defensively than Mishkov, and now he's outscoring Mishkov despite playing less games. And that's not me being a Penguins fan hating on the Flyer. My number 2 pick for the Calder, even if it is a big gap, would be Mishkov still. But Hudson for the Montreal Canadiens
I was impressed with him, the
fascinating.
defenseman.
Now, I do not think he's the second coming of Cale Makar or Quinn Hughes that people make him out to be, but that's going to be a very good NHL player that has a very long career. You just hope Montreal gets it together so it means something.
And I think his pedigree is a little bit less than I don't think he was the number 1 draft pick. Like
he was a second-round pick, I believe.
Yeah, like Mitchkov, who was.
I
mean,
actually
Mitchkov could have went number. Mitchkov could have been. He could have been like the Malkin that year if
he
he
should have
was
been the
coming
second
over.
overall pick in the draft. I was saying this on draft night. Montreal screwed up by not taking Mishkov.
That's right. You were saying that. You kept every time a pick would come up, you'd be like, "What the heck? I mean, Mitchkov's still there."
Yes,
I mean,
I get it. You're afraid of the KHL and the delay in getting him, but if you're that bad, it doesn't matter if he doesn't come over for 3 years. And you didn't even have to wait 3 years. He came over after 1.5.
Yep.
So there you go. But yeah, Mishkov's there, Hudson. I still like all the Stars young guys, Stankoven and Wyatt Johnson. I think they're legitimately great. The Kings have a bunch of kids contributing now. Byfield finally looks like the guy that was picked number 2 overall. Now, I don't think he's ever going to pass Stützle, who looks to be the best player in that draft. But it's so nice to see Byfield finally put it together for LA.
They actually just put Kelly on waivers, which I was actually
they did.
secretly
It was
hoping.
funny.
I was secretly hoping the Penguins would grab him, but the Rangers were.
Yeah, the Rangers,
there.
because of everything going on, they're below the Penguins in the standings, so
Yep.
they get first dibs. I'd rather watch him than a Matt Nieto type. But
Yep.
I'm trying to think of other young guys that have just blatantly impressed me. Seth Jarvis continues to be awesome.
He's
for
unbelievable.
This year is weird in that it's very polarizing. You have like 4 guys that really jump out at young guys, and then kind of a gap. And I think part of that is the Lafreniere draft, in hindsight now, wasn't as good as we thought it was. So not as many of those kids are breaking in. Even Bedard. Like, Bedard's been awesome, but he's not been what he was touted as, if that makes sense. You can't mention the names Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid and then be not struggling, but like is just pedestrian as Bedard seems to be at times. Yeah, like, and then, excuse me, no one else really on the Blackhawks. None of their young guys are really anything. That rebuild looks like it's stalling out in a big way. And then you get guys like Demidov that I think are going to be NHL stars that just aren't here yet. Consta Helenius, like a lot of these guys, they're just not in the league yet. So it's very polarizing. But I think the clear-cut 3 for the Calder are Celebrini, Big Gap, Mishkov, and Hudson. For me,
I agree. I agree with that. I don't think there's any young goalies in the league that you
actually, I was going to say, you know what? Maybe Askarov plays his way into that conversation because the Sharks, they're not good, but you can at least watch them and not like cringe in embarrassment at watching some of the stuff they did. Because anybody who's listening to the show that's a Pittsburgh fan, it was almost as bad or worse than the Generation X Penguins nonsense. It was bad. And that arena that used to be a very loud arena is just quiet. And I get it. Like, no one wants to sit and watch that mess. No one wants to go to a game and then be embarrassed that you're wearing the team's jersey or logo or whatever. So I'm happy for the Sharks and their fans that you're finally seeing some guys like Will Smith, Eklund, Askarov, and Celebrini. But yeah, Askarov's the real young goalie that I think has kind of jumped out. And I get why now, like why teams wanted him, because he was stuck behind Saros in Nashville, and now he's getting his chance. There's not a whole ton of like this rookie goalie jumping out at you. Like, yeah, Charlie Lindgren was good for the Caps last year, hasn't been as good this year. Logan Thompson's been starting more games than him now for them. So yeah, it's a weird, the goalie position's in a weird spot in that you have a lot of these guys right now that are in their late 20s, early 30s, the Hellebucks, the Vasilevskis, the Shesterkin. Like, Shesterkin's 29 already. Like,
Yeah,
again,
no, that's why that contract was a little. That's an impressive contract for a
it's
29
see, I
year
think
old.
it's smart to give it to him. For the same reason I thought it was smart to give Henrik Lundqvist his contract. He's really good, and then you're set at the position forever, or
Mhm.
the next 5-6 years, whatever conversation you need to have. A team, excuse me, that I mean, you have the Avalanche. I don't even know who they're starting at goalie right now. Like, goaltending position is as chaotic as it's ever been, and I think it's one of the reasons that scoring is higher. Is the goaltending is just not as good. The league is calling more penalties, and things have just kind of in general opened up a little bit. So it's hard, I think, for goalies to really, really stand out, unless you're like a Connor Hellebuck, who should be the runaway Vezina winner.
And Darren, before I let you go, you usually do you usually have a team that you not that you adopt this team, but there's a team that around this time of the year that you're like, wow, this is my team. Last year was your Stars. You loved the Stars. The Stars were your team that you said watch out for the Stars. You were saying that about the halfway point of the year. Who's your team right now that you're like, watch this team, man? They are just phenomenal.
I still think Dallas is going to put it together. I
Mhm.
really do. I still think it's like a 105 plus point team. But man, they had some injury problems last year. But look out below. The Vegas Golden Knights won the Stanley Cup 2 years ago, and they look good. Like, demonstrably good. They put Edmonton in the blender the other night. Jack Eichel is playing as good as he's ever been. They're getting good goaltending. They're healthy defensively. I think they're the best penalty kill in hockey, and they have a top 5 power play. I think the Knights are a team that people forgot about. They weren't quite as good last year with the injuries. All of a sudden, you're healthy. You have a good coach in Cassidy behind the bench. I think that's a team that if they get into the playoffs and just absolutely demolish the West, I would shrug my shoulders and be like, yeah, that makes sense. I don't think they're number one in the West right now, but they were for a few weeks. If you had me still pick I still think the best team in the league, top to bottom, is Dallas. They haven't necessarily played like it yet this year, but they'll probably figure it out. But right now, at this moment, I don't think any team in the league has been more impressive than Vegas, and I would pick them over anybody. Florida, any of the good teams, Washington, Edmonton, any of them.
What about Winnipeg?
Winnipeg to me is the Western Conference Rangers in that
Mhm.
it's a bit different in that they're better defensively, but they live and die with Hellebuck. And you saw last year, Hellebuck was awesome last year and then was not good in the postseason. And everything fell apart for them. I just don't like teams that are built that way fundamentally.
Is the worst team in hockey the Chicago Blackhawks? 28 points.
Um, Probably. I think them. Um, I'm really have to think about it. I mean, Buffalo's giving them a run for their money again. But it's probably the Blackhawks or the Sharks. And I was talking up the Sharks, and they're more watchable. They're still not a good team at all by any metric, outside of some of the young guys being fun. But right now, I'd go the Blackhawks.
Yeah, they got 28 points. I mean, they're the lowest in the NHL by
They're
4 over
unwatchable.
San Jose.
Don't score. They're horrible defensively, like legitimately awful. Like the kind of thing where you could not be someone who understands or watches a lot of hockey, like doesn't watch a lot of the game, and you'd watch the Blackhawks play a game and you'd be like, I don't know what I'm seeing, but it isn't good. It would be that kind of summation. Like they as bad as the Penguins were defensively early in the year, the Blackhawks make them look like the 90s Devils. It's embarrassingly bad. You're playing Nick Foligno first line minutes in the year 2025. Like there's nothing going well for them. Um, I think they need to flip Taylor Hall. They have to hope that if Bedard isn't the Crosby McDavid level talent, a lot of that rebuild gets very complicated very quickly in Chicago.
I agree, and I mean, I just looked it up. San Jose actually has the biggest. They're minus 41 totally. Chicago's minus 36. So I guess you could pretty much tell right there. Both teams are really struggling. But I agree with you. San Jose's upside is a lot better than Chicago's right now. There's some young guys that are going to be able to build around. They should be able to turn this around sooner than later. Darren, thank you so much for your time. It's great to be back with you. Hope you get better, man. Don't listen to your body. That's all I can tell you, man. 'Cause I went through about 13 days of it, and it was when my body said I had to lay down, I laid down, man. Just
No, I
listen to your body, man. Don't overdo it.
no, I'll appreciate that, JT, and I'll listen to that.
Listen to your body, man. And thank you so much for your time.
Anytime, man.
All right, man.